On Christmas Day, 2016, George Michael was found dead in his home. No stage, no audience, no farewell. A man who sold over 100 million records, who once controlled stadiums with his voice, ended his life in complete silence. Only after his death did the truth emerge. For years, he had secretly given away millions of dollars to strangers, never seeking credit. If he was not the reckless celebrity the world mocked, then who was George Michael, and what did fame quietly take from him before it took everything? For most of his life, the world believed it understood George Michael. He was labeled reckless, self-destructive, unstable, a superstar slowly wasting himself under the weight of excess. But that story only survived because the truth was invisible. While tabloids followed his arrests and relapses, they never followed the money he quietly gave away or the lives he kept alive without ever stepping forward. Years before his death, George Michael anonymously paid for the fertility treatment of a woman he had never met, simply because he overheard her crying on television. He covered medical bills for HIV patients whose names he never learned. He gave thousands at a time to homeless shelters, asking only that his identity remain hidden. These were not gestures for redemption or image repair. No one was supposed to know, and for years, no one did. At the same time, George was slowly disappearing from the public eye. He canceled tours, avoided interviews, rejected the very machine that had made him famous. Fame had given him everything except the one thing he needed most: privacy to exist as himself. The louder the world demanded his image, the quieter he became as a person. So when George Michael died alone, it wasn't a sudden collapse. It was the final chapter of a long withdrawal, a man stepping further into silence, while the world kept watching a version of him that no longer existed. The question is no longer how he died, but when he truly disappeared. Long before George Michael became a global symbol of freedom and desire, he was a quiet boy growing up in North London, born to an immigrant Greek father who believed discipline was the highest form of love. His home was not cruel, but it was rigid. Emotions were not discussed. Sensitivity was not encouraged. Masculinity had rules, and deviation was something to correct, not explore. In that environment, George learned early that survival meant control over his voice, his posture, his feelings. As a child, he was observant, withdrawn, and intensely self-aware. Music was not just entertainment for him. It was a private language, a place where he could exist without being questioned. While other children used sound to be louder, George used it to hide. Singing allowed him to express what he could never say aloud, but it also taught him something more dangerous. That approval came when he performed well enough. Love, even unspoken love, felt conditional. There was another truth George sensed long before he could name it. He knew he was different, not in a way that could be explained or defended, only in a way that demanded silence. In a world that expected certainty, he lived with uncertainty inside his own body. Instead of confronting it, he adapted. He studied how people reacted to him. He learned what made them smile, what made them listen, what made them stay. Slowly, a pattern formed. The more he shaped himself into something others wanted, the safer he felt. School offered no real refuge. He was not physically imposing, not traditionally confident, and certainly not interested in proving himself through dominance. But he had intelligence, humor, and an instinctive understanding of attention. George realized that charm could disarm judgment, and talent could override suspicion. By his teenage years, he was already rehearsing versions of himself, polished, likable, harmless. Each version moved him further away from the one thing he never felt allowed to be: honest. Music became both his weapon and his shield. Writing songs gave him power, but success amplified the pressure to maintain the illusion. Every compliment reinforced the idea that he was only valuable when he delivered something extraordinary. There was no space to fail quietly, no room to grow privately. The foundation of his identity was built not on self-discovery, but on performance. And performances, once rewarded, are hard to stop. By the time George stepped into the world as a young artist, he had already mastered something most people never do: how to disappear behind a smile. He wasn't running toward fame. He was running away from exposure. The stage offered distance. Lights blurred faces. Applause replaced questions. On stage, He could control what people saw. Off stage, he feared what would happen if they saw too much. This is where the contradiction begins. The world would later accuse George Michael of excess, rebellion, and self-indulgence. But the truth is colder. He didn't chase attention because he loved it. He learned to use attention because it kept people from looking too closely. Fame did not corrupt him. It protected him. And the better he became at wearing the mask, the harder it became to imagine living without it. So when George Michael finally stepped into the spotlight, it wasn't the beginning of his story. It was the moment his private self was permanently sealed behind a public image. And once that image began to succeed, there was no safe way back. The question is no longer how he became famous, but whether he ever had the chance to become himself at all. When Wham! Exploded onto the scene in the early 1980s, it looked effortless. Two young men, bright clothes, catchy hooks, and a kind of joy that felt almost engineered to escape seriousness. To the public, it was fun. To the industry, it was perfect. And to George Michael, it was the safest place he could have landed. Because nothing about Wham! Required him to be honest. Success arrived quickly and loudly. Singles climbed charts. Crowds grew larger, and George's face became recognizable almost overnight. But what truly made Wham! Unstoppable was not just the music. It was the image. George was positioned as approachable, charming, and unmistakably desirable. He was young, clean, and carefully readable. Nothing about him raised questions. That was not an accident. It was a design. Behind the scenes, George was already learning the rules of the machine. Visibility was currency. Desire was leverage. Ambiguity, if left uncontrolled, was danger. Every appearance was calculated. Every smile reinforced. Wham! Didn't just sell songs. It sold reassurance. And George understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone around him, that as long as he delivered that reassurance, the world would reward him generously. But something else was happening quietly, beneath the noise. George was writing. Not just hits, but songs with weight. Songs that carried doubt, longing, restraint. These weren't the kinds of emotions Wham! Was built to hold. They were too reflective, too inward, too close to the truth he kept buried. He began to sense the gap widening between the artist he was becoming and the product he was required to maintain. The problem was timing. George was still young, still climbing, and already deeply invested in the success of the persona. Walking away was not an option. Reinvention would have meant risk, and risk meant exposure. So instead, he learned how to split himself. One version of George performed joy and confidence on stage. Another version stayed silent, storing everything he couldn't say for later, if later ever came. As Wham's popularity peaked, George's control over the music increased. He pushed for more creative input, more authorship, more responsibility. On the surface, this looked like ambition. In reality, it was survival. Writing gave him ownership. Ownership gave him distance from the image. The more he wrote, the more he could hide inside the work itself. Music became a coded language, truth disguised as entertainment. When Wham! Eventually disbanded, the narrative presented to the world was clean and optimistic. George Michael, the gifted songwriter, was ready to stand alone, a natural evolution, a confident next step. But internally, this transition carried far more weight. Going solo meant visibility, without protection. There would be no shared spotlight, no playful branding to soften scrutiny. Every lyric, every gesture, every silence would now be interpreted as him. And yet, George stepped forward anyway. His solo debut was not subtle. It was deliberate, polished, and unapologetically controlled. The message was clear. He was not a boy anymore. He was a man with authority over his sound and image. Critics praised the confidence. Fans embraced the maturity. The industry applauded the transformation. From the outside, it looked like George Michael had finally found his voice. But control came at a cost. The more successful he became as a solo artist, the more tightly his image was managed. The world wanted clarity. The market demanded consistency. Ambiguity, the one thing George needed to breathe, was slowly erased. He was now a global symbol, not a developing human being. There was no room to pause, question, or recalibrate. What made this phase particularly dangerous was how rewarding it felt. Success validated the strategy. Distance worked. Silence paid. Every time George withheld the truth and delivered a performance instead, the system reinforced the behavior. The mask didn't crack. It strengthened. And with each success, the idea of removing it felt less like liberation and more like self-destruction. George Michael had officially entered his own path, but it was not the path he would have chosen freely. It was a narrow corridor lined with expectations, applause, and invisible walls. He had escaped the innocence of Wham, only to discover that independence came with a different kind of confinement. He was no longer protected by a group, but he was now protected by something far more dangerous: his own success. This was the moment the world mistook control for freedom. George mistook productivity for peace, and the machine mistook silence for stability. All three would be proven wrong, because the higher he climbed, the less space there was to turn around. And once the image of George Michael as a flawless solo icon was complete, it left no room for the man underneath to survive. The question now is not whether George Michael was ready for superstardom, but whether superstardom was ever going to allow him to remain human once he reached the top. By the late 1980s, George Michael was no longer rising. He had arrived. His solo work dominated charts. His face appeared everywhere, and his music crossed borders without resistance. Awards followed sales. Stadiums followed singles. The world agreed on one thing. This was not momentum anymore. This was dominance. From the outside, it looked like complete control. But control, when sustained too long, begins to resemble confinement. The success of Faith transformed George into a global standard. He wasn't just popular, he was expected. Every release carried pressure to confirm an identity that had already been approved. The industry didn't ask who he wanted to become next. It assumed he would continue being what worked. Reinvention was discouraged. Stability was profitable. And George, disciplined by years of conditioning, complied without protest. Fame at this level came with an invisible contract: visibility in exchange for predictability, adoration in exchange for access. George's body, voice, and image were no longer his alone. They belonged to a system that monetized consistency. Interviews became rehearsed. Appearances became strategic. Even absence required explanation. There was no neutral space left where he could exist without interpretation. At the height of his success, George began pulling back physically. He reduced tours. He limited public exposure. He avoided the camera when possible. This withdrawal was subtle at first, easily misread as arrogance or exhaustion. In reality, it was something more precise: resistance. He wasn't rejecting his audience. He was protecting the parts of himself that had not yet been consumed. But resistance inside a profit-driven machine is rarely welcomed. Executives push for more visibility, more content, more confirmation that the product remained intact. George was praised as an artist, but treated as an asset. Creative freedom was promised, then negotiated, then delayed. The illusion of autonomy remained intact only as long as it didn't disrupt revenue. The conflict reached its breaking point when George challenged his record label in court. Publicly, it was framed as a dispute over contracts. Privately, it was a battle over ownership of sound, direction, and self. George argued that the system restrained his growth, that art could not evolve under constant surveillance. The court disagreed. He lost, and with that loss came something deeper than disappointment: validation of his worst fear. He did not own himself. After the trial, something shifted. The anger didn't explode, it imploded. George stopped fighting publicly. Instead, he retreated further. Albums became less frequent. Promotion became minimal. The voice remained powerful, but the presence faded. This was not a collapse. It was a slow recalibration, an attempt to exist without being constantly consumed. Paradoxically, this withdrawal only deepened the myth. Fans speculated. Media filled gaps with assumptions. Silence became narrative fuel. George was described as difficult, unstable, unreliable. Few considered that he might simply be exhausted from living under a microscope. Fewer still recognized that success itself had become the primary source of pressure. At his peak, George Michael had achieved everything the industry promises: wealth, influence, creative recognition. And yet, the more complete the achievement became, the less space there was to breathe inside it. Every triumph closed another door. Every accolade reinforced the expectation to remain frozen at the moment of approval. The cruelest part of glory is how convincingly it mimics fulfillment. From the outside, George had won. From the inside, he was negotiating survival. He wasn't trying to escape fame. He was trying to survive it without disappearing entirely. But the system had no mechanism for partial presence. You were either visible or you were irrelevant. This was the stage where the contradiction hardened. George Michael was celebrated as a symbol of freedom, while living inside a structure that permitted none. He had the power to influence millions, but not the freedom to define himself honestly. And the higher he stood, the more dangerous it became to step out of alignment. By the time the applause stabilized and the headlines softened, the damage had already been done. The cage was now gilded, admired, and normalized. The world called it success. George called it distance. And distance, when prolonged, turns into isolation. The question is no longer how high George Michael climbed, but how much of himself he had to leave behind to stay there. The collapse did not begin with scandal. It began with loss. In the early 1990s, George Michael's partner, Anselmo Felpa, was diagnosed with AIDS. At the time, the disease still carried fear, stigma, and silence. For George, it carried something worse: the certainty that love, once found, could not be protected. When Anselmo died, George lost more than a partner. He lost the only place where the performance ended. Grief did not arrive publicly. There were no confessions, no pauses allowed by the machine. The world continued to consume George Michael as an image. Confident, controlled, untouched. Privately, he was unraveling. He wrote through it. But even the songs felt constrained, coded, indirect. Mourning had to be hidden. Pain had to remain presentable. Invisibility became his only defense. This was the moment isolation turned from strategy into condition. George was no longer withdrawing to protect himself. He was withdrawing because there was nowhere left to stand without being seen incorrectly. Love had shown him who he was. Fame ensured he could never be that person openly. The contradiction tightened. Then came exposure. In 1998, George Michael was arrested in a public restroom in Los Angeles. The incident itself was brief. The aftermath was not. Overnight, the world reduced him to a headline. Years of restraint, discipline, and silence were flattened into mockery. Late-night jokes, tabloid glee, moral judgment disguised as humor. For the first time, George did not control the narrative, and the narrative showed no mercy. What followed was not a traditional coming out. It was an extraction. The truth was dragged into the open, not offered. Context didn't matter. Pain didn't matter. The industry that once protected the illusion now benefited from its collapse. George responded with composure, even wit. Publicly, he appeared unbothered. Internally, something fundamental broke. The humiliation was not about sexuality. It was about agency. George had lived his entire life choosing when and how to reveal himself. That choice was gone. The one thing he had preserved since childhood, control over exposure, had been taken. And once taken, it could never be reclaimed. In the years that followed, George Michael became increasingly erratic in the public eye. Arrests, relapses, absences. Each incident was treated as evidence of self-destruction. But the pattern was misread. This was not rebellion. It was anesthesia. Substances did not give George pleasure. They gave him silence. They slowed the world enough for him to exist without interpretation. The more the media framed him as unstable, the more George retreated. Interviews stopped. Appearances dwindled. The voice remained, but the body disappeared. He began living at a distance from his own career, releasing music without engaging in its promotion. It was not disinterest, it was self-preservation. Fame had become too loud to survive without numbing. What made this phase especially dangerous was its invisibility. George was not screaming for help. He was functioning, writing, recording, donating quietly. From the outside, it looked like inconsistency. From the inside, it was maintenance. Every day was a calculation. How to stay alive without being fully present in a world that refused to let him be whole. The industry had no language for this kind of collapse. There was no diagnosis, no intervention, no pause. A star was either productive or problematic. George was labeled the latter. Sympathy was rare. Curiosity even rarer. Few asked what it cost to live as a symbol while grieving as a human being. By the time the public narrative hardened George Michael as a troubled icon, it no longer mattered what he did. Every action confirmed the assumption. Every silence became suspicion. The man behind the music had been replaced by a simplified cautionary tale. And once someone becomes a symbol of decline, recovery is rarely recognized even if it happens. This was the darkest contradiction of all. George Michael had never been more honest internally and never been more misunderstood externally. He had stopped performing happiness, but the world interpreted that refusal as failure. The collapse was not sudden. It was procedural, a long sequence of moments where being real cost more than being invisible. And as George drifted further from the image that once protected him, the question became unavoidable. When the mask finally cracks, does the person underneath get a chance to survive, or are they already too far inside the silence to be reached? After the headlines faded, what remained was not recovery, but distance. George Michael did not rebuild himself publicly. He reorganized his life to require as little visibility as possible. Tours became rare. Interviews disappeared. When he did release music, he often refused to promote it. This wasn't defiance. It was fatigue. The cost of being seen had become higher than the reward of being heard. How do you stay present in a world that only listens when you are exposed? Behind closed doors, his life narrowed. Days were quieter, nights longer. He wrote less for charts and more for containment. Songs became confessions without witnesses. He stopped competing with relevance and began negotiating survival. The industry interpreted this as decline. In truth, it was adaptation. George was learning how to exist without constantly being consumed. But adaptation can look like disappearance when measured by the wrong metrics, can it? Substances remain part of the equation, but not in the way the public imagined. They were not symbols of excess or rebellion. They were tools. Tools to slow the noise. Tools to sleep. Tools to endure the constant replay of loss and judgment. Each relapse was treated as spectacle, but none addressed the underlying condition. A man whose inner life had nowhere to land safely. When the world refuses complexity, where does pain go? Yet even as George withdrew, something else intensified his generosity. He gave quietly, deliberately, without recognition. He paid medical bills for strangers. He supported HIV charities long after public attention moved on. He helped people he would never meet, often insisting his name never be mentioned. This wasn't image repair. It was alignment. If he could no longer live honestly in public, he would live honestly in private. Is it possible to rebuild integrity when identity itself has been fractured? The paradox deepened. The more he disappeared from the spotlight, the more the spotlight defined him in his absence. Media narratives hardened. Silence was interpreted as instability. Distance was labeled arrogance. The man who had once been praised for control was now criticized for retreat. There was no version of restraint that satisfied the machine once momentum slowed. When success pauses, does the system allow stillness or only collapse? Health issues followed. Accidents, hospitalizations, each incident framed as confirmation of a downward spiral. Rarely mentioned were the years of pressure that preceded them, or the psychological toll of living as a permanent symbol. The body, after all, keeps its own record. And when the mind has been managing contradiction for decades, the body eventually asks for payment. How long can anyone negotiate against themselves without consequence? George Michael was still creating, still caring, still thinking deeply about the world. But none of that fit the simplified narrative. Complexity does not trend. Nuance does not headline. And so his life was reduced to fragments, moments stripped of context, choices stripped of cause. The truth became something only those close to him could see, and even they understood it imperfectly. When misunderstanding becomes permanent, does explanation still matter? As years passed, George settled into a quieter rhythm. Not peace, something closer to truce. He avoided conflict by avoiding exposure. He managed his days carefully, conserving energy, limiting damage. It was not the life of a fallen star. It was a life of man attempting to live without being rewritten by others. But the cost of such caution is isolation, and isolation, sustained long enough, begins to feel indistinguishable from loneliness. By the time George Michael reached his final years, the collapse had already done its work, not in spectacle, but in erosion. Relationships had thinned, trust had narrowed. The world still expected the icon, while the man had learned to survive only by remaining unseen. The distance between those two versions was no longer bridgeable. And when death arrived quietly, it felt less like an interruption than an ending that had been approaching for a long time. This is the moment where the story turns, not toward tragedy, but toward meaning, because collapse does not always end in destruction. Sometimes it forces a redefinition of value, away from applause, away from performance, toward something smaller and more human. The question now is not what George Michael lost, but whether, in stepping back on the world, he found a different way to exist within it at all. Rebirth did not arrive as redemption. There was no grand return, no dramatic announcement, no public apology tour. What followed the collapse was quieter and far less visible. George Michael did not try to correct the world perception of him. He stopped arguing with it. The turning point was not about reclaiming fame. It was about redefining what mattered once fame had lost its authority. For the first time in decades, George began making decisions that were not optimized for approval. He recorded music on his own terms, released it without urgency, and accepted that silence would follow. Chart positions no longer dictated value. He wrote because writing steadied him. Singing became less about performance and more about regulation. The voice that once commanded stadiums was now used to keep himself intact. Is that still success when the audience no longer notices? This period was marked by intentional limitation. George reduced his exposure deliberately, not out of fear but out of clarity. He understood something the industry never teaches. Constant visibility erodes meaning. By choosing when to appear and when not to, he regained a measure of control that had been missing since childhood. It was not freedom, but it was autonomy. And autonomy, even partial, changed the shape of his days. Relationships became fewer but more deliberate. He trusted slowly. He allowed closeness without spectacle. The absence of constant scrutiny created room for ordinary moments, meals without commentary, conversations without consequence. These moments would never make headlines, but they restored something essential: the sense that his life belonged to him again. After decades of being consumed, privacy became a form of resistance. George also began speaking more openly, though still selectively, about mental health, loss, and the cost of public identity. When he did speak, it was without theatrics. No manifesto, no crusade, just acknowledgement. He did not seek to be understood by everyone. He only needed to be understood by himself. In a culture obsessed with explanation, he chose acceptance instead. Was this retreat, or was it maturity finally allowed to exist? Music from this period carried a different weight, less polished, less urgent, more reflective. It did not ask for attention. It assumed the listener was already present. Themes of forgiveness, restraint, and endurance replaced ambition and desire. These were not comeback records. They were maintenance records. Art created to sustain a life rather than expand a legacy. The industry had no language for this shift, but George no longer required its validation. One of the most telling changes was how he gave. Charity was no longer a secret coping mechanism. It was a principle. He continued to donate quietly, but with intention rather than urgency. Giving became an extension of his values, not a response to guilt or pain. He had learned that impact did not require visibility, that influence did not require control, and that generosity, when detached from recognition, could be grounding rather than draining. Despite this internal stabilization, the external narrative barely changed. Media coverage remained inconsistent. Old labels persisted. Silence was still misread. But George no longer corrected them. He understood that the story people wanted was not the story he was living, and instead of fighting that mismatch, he accepted it as the cost of peace. The rebirth was not visible because it did not need to be. What made this phase fragile was not relapse or scandal, but isolation. Choosing a quieter life narrowed the circle of witnesses. Fewer people saw the work he was doing to remain present. Fewer noticed the discipline required to live without numbing. Stability without celebration can feel lonely, especially for someone conditioned to equate attention with worth. George managed his tension carefully, but it never fully disappeared. Still, this was the closest he came to balance. Not happiness, but equilibrium. Not fulfillment, but coherence. He was no longer chasing a version of himself approved by the world. He was living with the consequences of having stepped away from it. The rebirth was incomplete, but it was real. And in a life shaped by performance, reality was the most radical achievement of all. The turning point did not save George Michael, but it did change how he lived the time that remained. He was no longer trying to be understood by millions. He was trying to be tolerable to himself. And in a story defined by exposure, restraint became the final form of strength. The question now is not whether George Michael found peace, but what happens to a man who finally learns how to live quietly in a world that only knows how to listen when someone is loud. George Michael died on Christmas Day, 2016. The announcement was brief, restrained, almost procedural. No dramatic circumstances were offered, no mythology constructed. A global icon passed quietly at home after years of living increasingly out of sight. For a man once defined by visibility, the ending was stark, and yet it was consistent with how he had chosen to live once he stopped performing his life for others. How does the world respond when a symbol refuses spectacle even in death? In the days that followed, tributes poured in. Fellow musicians spoke of his influence. Fans revisited songs that had soundtracked entire eras. The industry reclaimed him as a legend. But something else began to surface, slowly, unintentionally, and without design. Stories emerged not from press releases, but from ordinary people, nurses, charity workers, strangers. Each carried a piece of a life the public had never seen. It became clear that George Michael had spent years giving away his money anonymously, not as a campaign, not as reputation management, but as habit. He paid for medical treatments. He covered fertility costs for women who had lost hope. He supported HIV charities long after attention moved elsewhere. He gave without asking to be thanked, and often without allowing his name to be recorded. This was not generosity as performance. It was generosity as alignment. The contrast was uncomfortable. The man remembered publicly as unstable, indulgent, and erratic had lived privately with discipline, empathy, and restraint. The narratives did not match. And because they did not match, the legacy required revision. People were forced to confront the gap between what they believed and what had actually been true. How many other lives had been simplified beyond recognition? In reassessing George Michael, the conversation shifted. His music was no longer framed solely as pop achievement, but as emotional architecture. Songs designed to hold tension, conceal pain, and regulate identity. Lyrics once dismissed as romantic or commercial took on new weight when placed against the life that produced them. His restraint became legible. His silences became meaningful. His absence became explanatory. Yet legacy is not built only from correction. It is shaped by what endures. George Michael's influence remains visible not just in sound, but in posture. In artists who refuse overexposure, who protect privacy, who challenge the assumption that relevance requires constant access. His life became a cautionary example not of excess, but of cost. The cost of being known before being understood. The cost of performing coherence while privately disintegrating. There is no clean moral to extract. George Michael was not a martyr, and he was not a victim. He made choices. Some sustained him, some harmed him. What distinguishes his story is not tragedy, but contradiction. He lived as a symbol of freedom while struggling to experience it. He gave generously while being perceived as self-destructive. He withdrew not to disappear, but to survive. These contradictions do not resolve neatly. They remain. After his death, the world gained access to truths it had not earned while he was alive. This, too, is part of the legacy. Recognition came late. Understanding arrived without utility. Apologies, where they existed, changed nothing for the person they were meant for. The system moved on, slightly corrected, largely unchanged. And George Michael remained where he had always been, misread, admired, and incomplete in public memory. What lingers is not the spectacle of his downfall, but the quiet consistency of his values, the refusal to exploit pain, the resistance to being reduced, the choice to live smaller when living larger became unsustainable. His legacy is not instruction. It is evidence. Evidence that success can coexist with erosion, that generosity can exist without visibility, that silence is not always absence. George Michael's life did not end with resolution. It ended with coherence. He did not fix the world's misunderstanding of him, but he stopped allowing to define his inner life. That may not be redemption, but it is integrity. And integrity, when achieved late and quietly, rarely receives applause. The question that remains is not how George Michael should be remembered, but whether we are capable of recognizing the cost of brilliance before it disappears into silence again. George Michael's story does not end with triumph, nor does it end with collapse. It ends with a quieter truth that is far less comfortable. Talent can survive fame, but identity often does not. He was not destroyed by excess, nor saved by withdrawal. He was shaped, narrowed, and slowly compressed by a system that rewarded performance while punishing authenticity. For decades, the world celebrated George Michael as a symbol of freedom, desire, confidence, without ever asking whether the man behind the symbol could live inside it. Every success reinforced the illusion. Every silence was misread. And by the time understanding arrived, it came too late to be useful to the person it concerned. His life exposes a structural failure, not a personal one. An industry that demands constant access. A culture that confuses visibility with worth. An audience that consumes stories faster than it understands people. George Michael did not fail to adapt to fame. Fame failed to make room for a human being who needed privacy to survive. What remains is not a warning against success, but a question about cost. How many artists are applauded for their strength, while quietly eroding inside expectations they never agreed to carry? How many lives are simplified because complexity is inconvenient? And how often do we mistake silence for weakness, when it is sometimes the last form of self-preservation left? George Michael did not disappear because he had nothing left to give. He disappeared because he had already given more than the world ever noticed. The real tragedy is not that he died quietly, but that he lived loudly for so long without being heard at all. So the question is not how George Michael should be remembered, but whether we are willing to listen differently before the next voice fades into silence.